Have you ever looked at the world and wondered why injustice seems to win? Why corruption prospers? Why the wicked rise to power? And why God sometimes appears silent while suffering continues? Thousands of years ago, a prophet asked those same questions. His name was Habakkuk, and instead of speaking to people on behalf of God, he did something unusual. He challenged God directly. He asked why evil was flourishing, why justice seemed delayed, and how a holy God could allow such chaos in the world. But the answer he received would shake everything he believed, because God revealed a plan so unexpected, so unsettling, that it forced the prophet into a deeper journey of faith. This is the story of the prophet who dared to question God and discovered a faith strong enough to stand when everything else collapses. Before we begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a deeper understanding of faith and justice today. Now, let's step into the powerful story of Habakkuk. History remembers prophets as men who spoke for God, but the story of Habakkuk begins with something far more unsettling. A prophet who dared to speak to God with questions, not polite questions, not ceremonial prayers, but raw, urgent, almost uncomfortable questions about justice, suffering, and the silence of heaven. Most prophetic books begin with a declaration. Thus says the Lord. Habakkuk begins differently. It begins with a complaint. The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. Habakkuk 1:1. The word burden is important. In Hebrew, it refers to something heavy, something difficult to carry. It is the weight of revelation, the weight of seeing reality clearly when others refuse to look. Habakkuk lived during one of the most morally unstable periods in the history of Judah. The nation that had once been called God's covenant people had drifted into corruption. Violence filled the streets. Justice was manipulated. The powerful oppressed the weak. The courts were compromised. The law existed, but it had become ineffective. Habakkuk describes the situation with painful clarity. Therefore the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth, for the wicked doth compass about the righteous. Habakkuk 1:4. In other words, evil had surrounded righteousness, and it seemed like no one could stop it. Kings were failing. Leaders were corrupt. Religious institutions had lost their moral authority. But the most disturbing part was not merely the wickedness, it was the silence of God. Habakkuk had been watching, observing, praying, waiting, and the longer he watched, the heavier the burden became, because from his perspective, heaven appeared to be doing nothing. So Habakkuk did something that many believers feel, but rarely dare to express aloud. He asked God, why? O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Habakkuk 1:2. This was not a casual prayer. It was a desperate question. The phrase how long echoes throughout the scriptures. It appears in the Psalms, in the cries of persecuted saints, and even in the book of Revelation. It is the cry of people who believe God is just but cannot understand why injustice continues. Habakkuk was not doubting God's existence. He was struggling with God's timing. Why does evil seem to thrive? Why do the violent prosper? Why does injustice appear to go unpunished? These questions were not theoretical to Habakkuk. They were visible in everyday life. He saw the innocent suffering. He saw corruption go unchallenged. He saw the legal system fail the very people it was meant to protect. And as a prophet, he carried a unique responsibility. Prophets were meant to understand God's perspective. They were meant to help the people interpret the times. But what happens when the prophet himself cannot understand what God is doing? Habakkuk found himself standing in that uncomfortable space, a space between faith and confusion. And instead of suppressing the questions, he brought them directly to God. This alone makes the book of Habakkuk remarkable, because it reveals something about the nature of faith. Faith is not the absence of questions. Faith is the courage to bring those questions to God, rather than walking away from Him. Habakkuk did not abandon his belief in divine justice, but he could not reconcile what he believed about God with what he was witnessing in the world. So he confronted heaven with honesty. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance. Habakkuk 1-3 in modern language. Habakkuk was saying, God, why are you letting me see all this injustice if you are not going to do anything about it? It was the kind of question that many believers have whispered in moments of pain. Why does God allow evil? Why do the wicked appear to succeed? Why does justice sometimes seem delayed? For Habakkuk, these were not philosophical debates. They were spiritual tensions unfolding in real time, and the prophet refused to ignore them. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface of these questions. Habakkuk was wrestling with the character of God. He believed God was righteous. He believed God was just. He believed God ruled over nations. Yet the reality around him seemed to contradict those beliefs. This tension between what we believe about God and what we observe in the world is one of the oldest struggles in human history. And Habakkuk stood directly in the middle of it. Many people assume that prophets were always confident, always certain, always filled with clarity. But the book of Habakkuk reveals a different picture. It reveals a prophet who was thinking deeply, watching carefully, and refusing to accept shallow answers. He was not rebelling against God. He was demanding understanding. And that distinction matters, because rebellion turns away from God. Habakkuk turned toward God with his questions. That is why the book reads like a conversation. Unlike other prophetic writings, where God speaks to the people, Habakkuk records a dialogue between a prophet and the divine. It is almost as if we are listening to an intimate exchange, a man standing before heaven asking, God, are you seeing what I'm seeing? But what Habakkuk did not realize was that God had been watching all along, and the answer that was coming would shock him, because God's response would not be what the prophet expected. In fact, it would raise even deeper questions. God was not ignoring injustice. He was preparing to deal with it. But the way he planned to do it would challenge everything Habakkuk thought he understood about divine justice. The prophet had asked why evil was flourishing. God was about to reveal that judgment was coming, but it would arrive through a nation far more terrifying than Habakkuk imagined. A ruthless empire rising in the east. An army known for brutality. A people feared across the ancient world. The Babylonians. And when Habakkuk heard God's plan, the prophet who dared to question injustice would soon find himself asking an even more troubling question. How could a holy God use a wicked nation to judge his own people? The conversation between heaven and earth was only beginning, and the answers Habakkuk was about to receive would force him and everyone who reads his story to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes God's justice does not look the way we expect. Sometimes his methods disturb our assumptions, and sometimes the questions we ask God lead us into deeper mysteries rather than immediate explanations. But Habakkuk's journey was far from over, because the prophet who began with confusion would eventually discover something that would echo through generations of believers, a truth so powerful that centuries later it would reshape the theology of the Apostle Paul, a statement that would become one of the most famous lines in Scripture. But before Habakkuk could reach that revelation, he would first have to wrestle with a disturbing answer from God. An answer that would shake him to his core. And it begins with 3 words that no prophet expected to hear. Look among the nations. Habakkuk had asked a difficult question. Why was injustice thriving in Judah? Why did violence seem to go unchecked? Why did God appear silent while corruption surrounded the righteous? The prophet expected an explanation, perhaps a promise that reform was coming, perhaps a declaration that God would soon purify the nation. But the answer Habakkuk received was something far more unsettling. God spoke with authority and urgency. Behold ye among the nations, and regard, and wonder marvelously. For I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. Habakkuk 1-5. In other words, God was saying, you think nothing is happening, but I am already at work. And what I am about to do will shock you. It will be so unexpected that if someone told you about it beforehand, you would struggle to believe it. This was not the response Habakkuk anticipated. The prophet had assumed that heaven was inactive, but God revealed something profound. Divine silence does not mean divine absence. Even when events appear chaotic and unjust, God may already be moving in ways that human eyes cannot yet see. But the next words from God would create a deeper problem. For, lo, I raise up the Chaldeans. Habakkuk 1-6, the Chaldeans, another name for the Babylonians. At the time Habakkuk lived, Babylon was becoming one of the most feared powers in the ancient world. They were not merely a strong nation, they were a terrifying one. The Babylonians were known for their military efficiency, their ruthless expansion, and their willingness to destroy entire cities that resisted them. Their armies moved across regions like a storm, and God was saying that He was the one allowing their rise. I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation. Habakkuk 1:06. The phrase bitter and hasty describes a people driven by conquest. They moved quickly, they conquered aggressively. They were not restrained by moral considerations. God continued describing them, alarming detail. They shall march through the breadth of the land, to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. Habakkuk 1-6. They were expansionists. They believed territory existed to be taken. Borders meant nothing to them. Their ambition was limitless. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Habakkuk 1-7. This meant the Babylonians made their own rules. They did not submit to external authority. They defined justice according to their own power. What they declared became law. God's description grows even more intense. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. Habakkuk 1:08. Their cavalry moved with astonishing speed. Their soldiers attacked with the hunger of predators. They were relentless. Their army advanced with terrifying momentum. Their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from far. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. Habakkuk 1:08. Imagine an eagle diving toward its prey. That was how Babylon approached its enemies. Focus. Swift. Unstoppable. Double quotes. They shall come all for violence. Habakkuk 1:9. This was the most disturbing part. God was acknowledging that Babylon was a violent empire. Their motivation was conquest. Their methods were brutal. Cities that resisted them were burnt. Prisoners were enslaved. Entire populations were displaced. They shall gather the captivity as the sand. Habakkuk 1-9. In other words, the number of people they would capture would be enormous. Countless. Like grains of sand. Babylon would dominate kings and nations alike. And they shall scoff at the kings, and the princes shall be a scorn unto them. Habakkuk 1:10. Kingdom would intimidate them. No ruler could easily resist them. They laughed at fortifications. They mocked defences. They shall deride every stronghold. For they shall heap dust, and take it. Habakkuk 1:10. Ancient cities depended on walls for protection, but Babylon knew how to defeat them. They built ramps of earth against the walls. They surrounded cities until supplies ran out. They crushed resistance through relentless pressure. And then came one of the most troubling statements. Then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over, and offend, imputing this his power unto his God. Habakkuk 1:11. The Babylonians did not give glory to the true God. They credited their victories to their own strength and their own gods. Their military power became an object of worship. They believed their success proved their superiority. And according to God's message, this empire was about to become the instrument of judgment against Judah. For Habakkuk, this was shocking. The prophet had complained about corruption in Judah, but Judah was still God's covenant nation. The Babylonians were far worse. They were ruthless. Pagans. How could God use a nation like that to correct his own people? Habakkuk had asked God to address injustice, but now it seemed as if God was empowering a greater injustice. This created a theological crisis for the prophet, because it appeared to contradict everything he believed about God's holiness. How could a righteous God use an unrighteous nation as his tool? The more Habakkuk thought about it, the more troubled he became. And this leads to the second complaint of the prophet. Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, mine Holy One? Habakkuk 1:12 Notice something important. Even in confusion, Habakkuk begins by affirming God's character. You are eternal, you are holy, you are my God. The prophet still believes, but belief does not remove the tension. We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment. And, O mighty God, thou hast established them for correction. Habakkuk 1:12 Habakkuk understands what God is saying. Babylon is coming as an instrument of discipline, but that understanding does not make it easier to accept, because the prophet now confronts a deeper dilemma. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Habakkuk 1:13 Habakkuk is quoting what he knows about God's nature. God is too holy to tolerate evil. God cannot approve of wrongdoing. So the prophet asks the question that follows logically, wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously? Habakkuk 1:13 Why would God allow treacherous people to succeed? And holdest thy tongue when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he. Habakkuk 1:13 Judah was sinful, but Babylon was worse. How could the more wicked destroy the less wicked? To Habakkuk, it seemed morally inconsistent. The prophet continues describing the cruelty of Babylon. They take up all of them with the angle. They catch them in their nets. Habakkuk 1:15 Like fishermen capturing helpless fish. Nations were falling into Babylon's control, and Babylon celebrated their victories. They sacrifice unto their net, and burn incense unto their drag. Habakkuk 1:16 They worshipped their own military strength. They glorified the instruments of conquest. And so Habakkuk asks the final question of this section. Shall they therefore empty their net, and not spare continually to slay the nations? Habakkuk 1:17 Will this cycle of violence continue forever? Will Babylon keep conquering without accountability? Habakkuk had begun by questioning why God seemed inactive. Now he was questioning why God's solution seemed worse than the problem. And the prophet reaches a critical moment. Instead of walking away in frustration, instead of abandoning faith, Habakkuk does something remarkable. He decides to wait for God's response. I will stand upon my watch, and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me. Habakkuk 2:1 This image is powerful. A watchman standing on a tower. Looking toward the horizon. Waiting for a message. Habakkuk had asked his questions. Now he would wait for heaven's reply. But the answer God was about to give would become one of the most important declarations in the entire Bible. A statement that would echo across centuries. A sentence that would define the nature of true faith. And it begins with a command. Write the vision. Habakkuk had asked his questions. He had spoken honestly. He had wrestled with the mystery of God, using a wicked empire to judge his own people. And instead of walking away in frustration, the prophet did something rare. He chose to wait for God's response. I will stand upon my watch, and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me. Habakkuk 2:1 This image is deliberate. In ancient cities, watchmen stood on towers along the walls. Their responsibility was to look into the distance for approaching armies or important messages. They remained alert while others slept. Habakkuk compares himself to one of those watchmen. He positions himself spiritually on the tower. He has asked God difficult questions, but now he refuses to abandon the conversation. Instead, he waits. Quietly. Expectantl. Why? This moment reveals something profound about the prophet's character. Habakkuk did not assume he had the final answer. He believed God would respond. And that belief required patience. Too often, people bring their frustrations to God and then walk away before listening. But Habakkuk remained at his post. Watching. Listening. Waiting for divine clarity. And God answered. And the Lord answered me, and said, Write the vision, and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. Habakkuk 2. To this command was unusual. God did not simply speak a message for Habakkuk to deliver verbally. He instructed the prophet to write it down. And not just write it clearly, The phrase "make it plain" suggests that the message should be easily understood. It should not be hidden in complicated language or obscure symbolism. Anyone who read it should grasp the meaning immediately. Why? So that he may run that readeth it. Scholars interpret this phrase into possible ways. One interpretation suggests that the message should be written large enough that someone could read it while running past. Another interpretation suggests that the reader, once understanding the message, would run to share it with others. Either way, the emphasis is clear. This vision was not meant to remain private. It was meant to be public and urgent. God was revealing something that future generations would need to remember. But then God added another statement that introduced tension. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. Habakkuk 2:3. This meant the message would not be fulfilled immediately. It pointed toward a future moment that God had already determined. Human beings often expect God to act instantly, but God works according to appointed times. Moments in history when events unfold precisely as He intends. Habakkuk wanted justice now, but God was telling him that the full unfolding of justice would require patience. At the end it shall speak, and not lie. Habakkuk 2:3. In other words, when the appointed moment arrives, the truth of the vision will become undeniable. It will speak for itself. No one will be able to deny that God's word has been fulfilled. And then comes a phrase that has encouraged believers for centuries. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. Habakkuk 2:3. At first glance, the sentence appears contradictory. It says the vision may seem delayed, yet it will not truly delay. The meaning is subtle but powerful. From a human perspective, God's promises may appear slow, but from God's perspective, they arrive exactly on time. What looks like delay to us is often preparation in the unseen realm. Habakkuk had been troubled by the apparent success of evil, but God was reminding him that justice unfolds according to divine timing. Then comes one of the most important statements in the entire book, a sentence that would echo through the New Testament and shape Christian theology for centuries. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Habakkuk 2:4. This verse introduces a contrast between two types of people: the proud and the faithful. The proud person relies on his own power. His soul is lifted up. He believes his strength, his intelligence, or his influence will secure his future. This description fits the Babylonian Empire perfectly. Babylon trusted in military strength. They glorified their own achievements. Their confidence was rooted in conquest. But God declares that such pride is not upright. It is unstable. It eventually collapses under its own weight. Then God presents the alternative: the just shall live by his faith. This statement carries extraordinary depth. It means that those who are righteous, those who belong to God, will survive not by power, not by wealth, and not by political alliances. They will live by faith. Faith means trusting God's character even when circumstances appear confusing. Faith means believing that divine justice exists even when evil temporarily flourishes. Faith means holding on to God's promises when the present moment feels uncertain. For Habakkuk, this message was revolutionary. The prophet had been searching for immediate answers, but God was shifting his focus. Instead of explaining every detail of the future, God was inviting him to trust, because faith sustains people during seasons when explanations are incomplete. This single sentence would later become foundational in Christian teaching. The Apostle Paul quoted it in the book of Romans to explain how people are made right with God. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Romans 1:17, he repeated it again in Galatians. And that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Galatians 3:11, and the writer of Hebrews echoed the same truth. Now the just shall live by faith. Hebrews 10:38, what began as God's answer to Habakkuk became a principle that defines the entire life of faith. But God's message to the prophet was not finished. The Lord then begins describing the downfall of the proud. He speaks of Babylon's greed, yea also, because he transgresseth by wine. He is a proud man, neither keepeth at home. Habakkuk 2:5. Babylon's appetite for conquest was insatiable, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied. Habakkuk 2:5. The imagery is intense. The empire's hunger for territory was compared to death itself, never satisfied, always expanding. But God makes something clear. Babylon's rise does not mean permanent victory. In fact, their arrogance would eventually become their downfall. The nations they conquered would one day rise against them. The victims of their oppression would remember. And when that moment came, Babylon would experience the same judgment they had inflicted on others. Habakkuk had been disturbed by the idea that God would use a wicked nation. But God was revealing a deeper truth. God may allow powerful empires to rise for a season, but no empire escapes accountability. Babylon was an instrument, not the final authority. And as Habakkuk listened to God's response, the prophet began to understand something that had previously been hidden. History is not random. Nations rise and fall within the boundaries of divine sovereignty. Even events that appear chaotic may be part of a larger unfolding plan. But God's explanation was not finished, because the Lord was about to pronounce a series of warnings, declarations of judgment against the arrogance, violence, and greed that defined Babylon's empire. 5 powerful statements, each beginning with the same word, woe. And these warnings would reveal something Habakkuk had been longing to hear. God had not forgotten justice. In fact, justice was already on its way. Habakkuk had struggled with a disturbing idea. How could a holy God use a violent empire like Babylon as an instrument of judgment? It seemed morally inconsistent. Babylon was ruthless. They conquered nations. They enslaved populations. They celebrated violence as if it were a sign of greatness. But as God continued speaking, a deeper truth began to emerge. Babylon would not escape accountability. The empire that rose through conquest would eventually face judgment itself. God's justice might appear delayed, but it was never absent. And in the next portion of the vision, the Lord delivers a series of declarations against Babylon, 5 prophetic warnings, 5 indictments, 5 pronouncements of inevitable downfall. Each one begins with the same haunting word, woe. In the language of the prophets, a woe is more than criticism. It is a declaration of coming judgment. It is a warning that the actions of the present will inevitably lead to consequences in the future. The first woe addresses greed and exploitation. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. How long? Habakkuk 2:6. This describes Babylon's expansion. They were not satisfied with their own territory. They accumulated wealth and land that belonged to others. Cities were conquered, treasures were seized, entire populations were forced into labor. Babylon built its empire by taking what did not belong to them. God continues, and to him that laddeth himself with thick clay. Habakkuk 2:6. This phrase is symbolic. It refers to someone who burdens himself with stolen wealth, like a man carrying heavy clay that will eventually weigh him down. The image suggests that the very riches Babylon gathered would become a liability. Their empire looked strong, but it was built on the unstable foundation of greed. Then comes the warning. Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee? Habakkuk 2:7. In other words, the nations Babylon conquered would not remain silent forever. One day they would rise, and when they did, the empire that once devoured others would become prey itself. Because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee. Habakkuk 2:8. Babylon's violence would eventually return upon them. History would prove this true. Decades later, Babylon itself would fall to the Medes and the Persians. The conqueror would become the conquered. The second woe addresses unjust gain and security built on oppression. Woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house. Habakkuk 2:9. Babylon had accumulated wealth, not simply for expansion, but for security. They believed their riches and their fortifications made them untouchable. The empire fortified its cities. Its capital city, Babylon, was famous for massive walls and defensive structures. They believed they had built a kingdom that could never collapse. But God saw something different, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Habakkuk 2:9. The image here is of a bird building its nest high in the cliffs, where predators cannot reach it. Babylon believed they had achieved that kind of safety, untouchable, invincible. But God exposes the illusion. Thou hast consulted shame to thy house by cutting off many people. Habakkuk 2:10. Babylon's security came through destruction. They eliminated nations. They removed opposition. They believed their empire was stable because they had crushed resistance, but their actions had planted the seeds of their own disgrace. Then comes a striking statement, for the stone shall cry out of the wall, and the beam out of the timber shall answer it. Habakkuk 2:11. This poetic image suggests that even the buildings of Babylon would testify against them. The stones in their palaces. The beams in their temples. The walls of their cities, all constructed through exploitation and violence. If the oppressed could not speak, the structures themselves would. The third woe addresses violence used to build power. Woe to him that buildeth a town with blood, and stablisheth a city by iniquity. Habakkuk 2:12. Empires often glorify their architecture. Their monuments, their grand cities, but God looks beyond appearances. He examines the foundations, and in Babylon's case, those foundations were soaked in blood. Cities built through oppression cannot stand forever, because injustice always carries consequences. Then God reveals something remarkable. Behold, is it not of the Lord of hosts, that the people shall labor in the very fire? Habakkuk 2:13. This means the work of oppressive empires ultimately becomes meaningless. They expend enormous effort building their dominance. But in the end, their achievements collapse like structures consumed by fire. Their legacy becomes smoke. And then comes one of the most beautiful promises in the book, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Habakkuk 2:14. This statement expands the perspective beyond Babylon. Beyond Judah. Beyond the immediate conflict of the prophet's time. God is revealing the ultimate direction of history. The violence of empires will not define the future. The pride of nations will not determine the final outcome. Instead, a day is coming when the knowledge of God's glory will fill the entire earth. Just as water fills the oceans completely. This verse hints at a future far beyond Habakkuk's lifetime, a time when divine justice and divine presence will reach every nation. But the warnings against Babylon continue. The fourth woe addresses corruption and humiliation. Woe unto him that giveth his neighbor drink, and makest him drunken also. Habakkuk 2:15. This imagery describes manipulation. Babylon intoxicated nations. They used deception and pressure to weaken others. They stripped nations of dignity. They exposed their vulnerability. But God declares that the humiliation they inflicted would return to them. Thou art filled with shame for glory. Habakkuk 2:16. Babylon pursued glory. They wanted recognition as the greatest empire of their time. But instead of glory, they would inherit shame. Drink thou also, and let thy foreskin be uncovered. Habakkuk 2:16. The imagery is symbolic of exposure and disgrace. The empire that humiliated others would eventually experience humiliation itself. Their power would collapse, their arrogance would be revealed. And the fifth and final woe addresses idolatry. Woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, to the dumb stone, arise. Habakkuk 2:19. Babylon worshipped idols, statues carved from wood and stone. Images that could not see. God challenges the absurdity of such worship. Can it teach? Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in the midst of it. Habakkuk 2:19. The idols looked impressive. They were decorated with precious metals, but they were lifeless. Powerless. Silent. They could not guide. They could not protect. They could not answer prayer. In contrast to those silent idols, God makes a final declaration. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Habakkuk 2:20. This statement shifts the atmosphere completely. Babylon's idols were silent because they were lifeless. But the Lord reigns. Alive. Sovereign. Present. And the proper response to his authority is reverence. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Habakkuk 2:20. The world may appear chaotic, empires may rise, violence may dominate headlines, but above all human activity, God remains. ENTHRAONED. Watching. Governing. Judging. Habakkuk had begun this journey with confusion. He wondered if God was ignoring injustice. Now he was beginning to see something extraordinary. God had not overlooked evil. Judgment was already woven into the future of Babylon. The empire that seemed unstoppable would eventually collapse under the weight of its own pride. But the most profound transformation was happening inside the prophet himself. The man who began with complaints was slowly being led into a deeper understanding of faith. Because knowing that God will eventually judge injustice is one thing. Learning to trust him while waiting for that justice to unfold is another. And Habakkuk was about to experience a shift that would turn his questions into something unexpected. Not another complaint, not another argument, but something entirely different. A prayer. By the time Habakkuk reached this moment, something inside the prophet had shifted. He had begun with confusion. He had looked at the corruption in Judah and wondered why God appeared silent. Then he had been shocked by God's answer that Babylon, a ruthless empire, would become the instrument of judgment. The explanation seemed troubling at first. But as God continued speaking, Habakkuk began to see the bigger picture. Babylon's power would not last forever. Their greed, their violence, their arrogance, and their idolatry would eventually bring about their downfall. God had not abandoned justice. Justice was unfolding on a timetable larger than Habakkuk had imagined. And now the tone of the book changes dramatically. The conversation turns into something deeply personal, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. Habakkuk 3:1. This line introduces the final chapter of the book. And it is not written like a typical prophetic message. It is written like a song. The word Shigionoth likely refers to a musical style, possibly an intense or emotional form of poetry meant to be sung. That detail matters, because Habakkuk's questions had been intellectual at first. He had wrestled with theology. He had debated divine justice. But now the prophet moves beyond argument. He begins to worship. His prayer opens with a remarkable statement. O Lord, I have heard thy speech, and was afraid. Habakkuk 3:2. To Habakkuk had heard God's explanation. He understood the coming judgment. He knew Babylon would rise. He knew nations would tremble, and the reality of those events filled him with awe. But notice what he asks next. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. Habakkuk 3:2. This is a plea. Habakkuk is asking God to act within his own generation. The phrase "in the midst of the years" suggests a longing for God's presence to become visible again during the unfolding events of history. Habakkuk does not ask God to cancel judgment. Instead, he asks God to reveal his power and purpose even while history moves through difficult seasons. And then comes one of the most moving requests in the entire prayer. In wrath remember mercy. Habakkuk 3:2. Habakkuk understands that judgment is coming, but he also knows something about God's character. God's justice is never separated from his mercy. Even when discipline unfolds, compassion remains part of the story. That single sentence reveals the prophet's hope. God may judge nations, but he does not abandon his people. And from this point forward, Habakkuk's prayer begins to recount the mighty acts of God in history. The prophet remembers how God had moved before, and those memories become the foundation for his faith in the present. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Habakkuk 3:3. These references point to regions associated with Israel's wilderness journey after the Exodus. Habakkuk is recalling the time when God revealed his glory during the formation of the nation. He continues, his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Habakkuk 3:3. The prophet begins describing the overwhelming majesty of God. This is not merely poetic language. It is a vision of divine power moving through history. And his brightness was as the light. Habakkuk 3. For the presence of God is described as radiant, blinding, like sunlight bursting across the horizon. He had horns coming out of his hand, and there was the hiding of his power. Habakkuk 3-4. The phrase horns in ancient imagery symbolize strength and authority. The picture is of unstoppable divine power radiating outward. Habakkuk then describes God advancing across the earth like a warrior. Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. Habakkuk 3:05. The imagery suggests judgment moving through the land. God confronting the forces that oppose his righteousness. He stood and measured the earth. He beheld and drove asunder the nations. Habakkuk 3:6. This is the language of sovereignty. God stands above the nations. Empires may believe they control history, but ultimately, they move within the boundaries established by God. And the everlasting mountains were scattered. Habakkuk 3-6. Even the most stable features of creation appear fragile in the presence of divine power. Mountains that seem permanent can crumble when God moves. Habakkuk continues describing God's past victories. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. Habakkuk 3:7. The prophet remembers how nations trembled when God acted on behalf of his people. Empires that once seemed intimidating were shaken by the presence of the Lord. Then Habakkuk asks a rhetorical question. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Habakkuk 3:08. He is recalling the miracles associated with Israel's deliverance. The parting of the Red Sea, the crossing of the Jordan River. Moments when God altered nature itself to protect his people. Thou didst ride upon thine horses, and thy chariots of salvation. Habakkuk 3:08. The imagery portrays God as a divine warrior leading the forces of deliverance. Habakkuk's prayer is no longer focused on confusion. Instead, he's remembering what God has done, remembering how God has acted in the past. And those memories become the foundation for trust, because if God has delivered before, he can deliver again. Habakkuk continues describing God's power. The mountains saw thee, and they trembled. Habakkuk 3:10. Creation itself responds to God's presence. Storms break open, floodwaters move, the sun and moon stand still. Sun and moon stood still in their habitation. Habakkuk 3:11. This likely references the miraculous event recorded in the book of Joshua, when God extended the daylight during a battle. Habakkuk is weaving together memories of divine intervention throughout Israel's history. Each story reinforces the same truth. God has always been involved, even when his actions seem delayed. The prayer continues with a declaration of purpose. Thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people. Habakkuk 3:13. This is the central theme of the entire chapter. God moves through history not randomly, but with intention. He acts to preserve his people and fulfill his promises. Habakkuk began his journey questioning God's justice. Now he is remembering God's faithfulness. The prophet's perspective is changing, because when people remember what God has done, they gain courage to trust him with what he is doing now. And Habakkuk's transformation is almost complete, but the prayer has not yet reached its most powerful moment. Because after remembering God's power, after recalling God's victories, after reflecting on God's faithfulness, Habakkuk will arrive at a declaration so profound that it continues to inspire believers thousands of years later. A statement about faith that refuses to depend on circumstances. A declaration of trust that stands even when everything visible collapses. And it begins with a confession of trembling. Habakkuk's prayer had carried him through memory and revelation. He had remembered God's mighty acts. He had reflected on how the Lord delivered Israel in the past. He had described divine power moving across mountains, rivers, and nations. But remembering God's past faithfulness did not erase the reality of the coming crisis. Babylon was still rising. Judgment was still approaching. History was still moving toward a painful season for Judah. And as the prophet considers the future, his response becomes intensely personal. When I heard, my belly trembled, my lips quivered at the voice. Habakkuk 3:16. This is not the language of calm detachment. Habakkuk if physically shaken. The news of what lies ahead has affected his entire being. Rottenness entered into my bones, and I trembled in myself. Habakkuk 3:16. The imagery communicates deep internal fear. Habakkuk understands the seriousness of what God revealed. Babylon's invasion would not be a small event. Cities would fall. Homes would be destroyed. Families would be displaced. The land would suffer. And the prophet feels the weight of it. Yet, even in his trembling, Habakkuk makes an important statement: that I might rest in the day of trouble. Habakkuk 3:16. This phrase reveals something remarkable. Habakkuk is afraid, but he is not hopeless. He recognizes that a day of trouble is coming, but he also believes that God will sustain him through it. Rest, in this context, does not mean the absence of difficulty. It means a deep inner confidence that God remains sovereign and when circumstances become painful. Habakkuk then imagines the worst possible scenario for his nation's economy and survival, because Judah's agricultural system was the foundation of daily life. If crops failed, the entire society suffered. And so the prophet lists a series of potential disasters. Although the fig tree shall not blossom. Habakkuk 3:17. Fig trees were valuable sources of food. Their fruit provided nourishment and trade. If they stopped producing, it would signal hardship. Neither shall fruit be in the vines. Habakkuk 3:17. Vineyards were central to agriculture in ancient Judah. Grapes were used for wine, which was a staple in everyday life. A vineyard without fruit meant economic loss. The labor of the olive shall fail. Habakkuk 3:17. Olive trees produced oil used for cooking, lighting lamps, and religious ceremonies. Olive oil was one of the most essential commodities in the region. If the olive harvest failed, daily life would become extremely difficult, and the fields shall yield no meat. Habakkuk 3:17. The crops grown in the fields, grain and other produce, were the primary food supply for the population. If the fields failed, famine could follow. The flock shall be cut off from the fold. Habakkuk 3:17. Sheep provided wool, meat, and economic stability. If the flocks disappeared, shepherds and farmers would lose their livelihood, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Habakkuk 3:17. Cattle represented wealth, labor, and food. Empty stalls would symbolize the collapse of the agricultural economy. Taken together, these statements describe complete economic devastation. Every major source of food and livelihood gone. No fruit. No crops. No animals. No security. Habakkuk is describing a future where the visible systems that sustain life have completely failed. And yet, what follows is one of the most extraordinary declarations of faith in all of Scripture. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk 3:18. The word yet is powerful. It represents a decision. Habakkuk is not denying the reality of suffering. He has already acknowledged it. He has imagined the worst possible circumstances, but he refuses to allow those circumstances to determine his faith. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Notice what he does not say. He does not say he will rejoice in prosperity. He does not say he will rejoice in successful harvests. He does not say he will rejoice in national stability. His joy is anchored in something deeper, in someone deeper. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk 3:18. This statement reveals the heart of biblical faith. True faith is not dependent on favorable conditions. It is rooted in relationship with God. Habakkuk's circumstances may collapse. His nation may suffer, but the God who saves remains unchanged. And that reality gives the prophet a reason to rejoice. The prayer continues with a declaration of strength. The Lord God is my strength. Habakkuk 3:19. Habakkuk does not claim personal resilience. He does not boast in his own ability to endure hardship. Instead, he acknowledges that his strength comes from God. When human resources fail, divine strength becomes the foundation for endurance. Then the prophet uses a beautiful image. And he will make my feet like hinds' feet. Habakkuk 3:19. A hind is a deer known for its agility. Deer can move across steep, rocky terrain with remarkable balance and speed. They navigate cliffs, and dangerous slopes without falling. The image suggests stability in difficult terrain. Habakkuk is saying that God will enable him to stand securely even when life becomes dangerous and uncertain. And he will make me to walk upon mine high places. Habakkuk 3:19. The phrase high places can symbolize victory or elevation above danger. It suggests that God will lift his people above circumstances that might otherwise overwhelm them. Habakkuk's transformation is now complete. The prophet who began with confusion has arrived at confidence. The man who questioned God's justice now trusts God's sovereignty. And the most striking part of his declaration is this: his faith does not depend on improvement in circumstances. The fig tree may still fail. The vineyards may remain empty. The fields may still produce nothing, yet his joy remains intact. This is what it means to live by faith. Faith is not pretending that suffering does not exist. Faith is choosing to trust God, even when suffering is real. Habakkuk's journey has taken him from complaint to conversation, to revelation, to worship. But his story carries a message far beyond his own lifetime, because the principle he discovered, the truth that the just shall live by faith, would echo through centuries of spiritual history. It would shape the teachings of Jesus' followers. It would influence the writings of the apostles. It would eventually spark movements that reshaped entire nations. And the courage Habakkuk discovered in the midst of uncertainty would continue to challenge future generations. Because every believer eventually faces the same question Habakkuk faced: what happens to faith when the visible signs of blessing disappear? When prayers seem unanswered? When injustice appears powerful? Habakkuk's answer is simple, but profound. Faith does not survive because circumstances improve. Faith survives because God remains faithful. And the story of Habakkuk closes with a quiet but powerful reminder that this message was meant to be shared, not just spoken, but sung. The book of Habakkuk ends with a musical note, not metaphorically, literally. Double quotes to the chief singer on my stringed instruments. Habakkuk 3:19. This final line reveals something many readers overlook. Habakkuk's prayer was not meant to remain private. It was meant to be performed, sung, shared in worship. That means the prophet's journey from confusion to faith became a song for the entire community of Israel. The people were meant to sing about trusting God when crops failed. They were meant to sing about rejoicing in God when circumstances collapsed. They were meant to sing about faith during seasons of uncertainty. Imagine the power of that. A nation facing invasion, a people aware that hardship is approaching, and yet they gather together and sing. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk's personal struggle became a collective declaration of faith, and this is one of the most remarkable aspects of the book. Habakkuk never received the kind of answer many people expect. God never explained every detail of why suffering happens. He never fully clarified the mystery of why one wicked nation would be used to discipline another. The prophet was not given a complete map of the future. Instead, he was given something deeper, a revelation of God's sovereignty. And that revelation transformed the way he viewed everything else. Because when people understand that God remains sovereign over history, their perspective changes. Circumstances may still be painful, but they are no longer meaningless. Habakkuk's story reminds us that faith is not built on perfect explanations. It is built on trusting God's character. And that truth would travel far beyond Habakkuk's lifetime. Centuries later, the words God spoke to the prophet would resurface in an entirely new context. The just shall live by faith. Habakkuk 2:4. Those 6 words would become one of the most influential statements in the entire Bible. When the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to believers in Rome, he quoted that exact phrase, "For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." Romans 1:17. Paul used Habakkuk's statement to explain how people are made right with God, not through human effort, not through perfect religious performance, but through faith. Trust. Dependence on God's grace. The same verse appears again in Paul's letter to the Galatians, and that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Galatians 3:11. And then once more in the book of Hebrews, now the just shall live by faith. Hebrews 10:38, 3 times in the New Testament, each time reinforcing the same principle. Life with God begins, continues, and endures through faith. It is remarkable to realize that one of the central doctrines of Christianity emerged from a conversation between a questioning prophet and God. Habakkuk asked why justice seemed delayed. God answered with a statement that would shape theology for generations. But the influence of this verse did not stop in biblical times. More than 1500 years later, those same words would ignite a spiritual revolution. In the 16th century, a German monk named Martin Luther struggled with a deep question about salvation. Luther believed in God. He studied Scripture. He practiced intense religious discipline, but he felt trapped by the fear that he could never become righteous enough to please God. He fasted, he prayed, he confessed his sins repeatedly, yet the more he tried, the more he felt inadequate. Then, while studying the book of Romans, Luther encountered Paul's quotation from Habakkuk, "The just shall live by faith," and suddenly the meaning became clear. Righteousness was not something human beings could achieve through effort. It was something received through faith in God. That realization sparked what historians now call the Protestant Reformation, a movement that reshaped Christianity across Europe. Churches were reformed, translations of the Bible spread across nations, millions of people rediscovered the central truth that salvation comes through faith in God's grace. And at the heart of that movement was a sentence spoken centuries earlier to a troubled prophet. The just shall live by faith. Habakkuk could not have imagined how far his story would travel, but that is often the way God works. Moments that seem personal can become messages for generations. And the book of Habakkuk continues to speak into modern life, because the questions Habakkuk asked are still being asked today. Why does injustice persist? Why do corrupt systems appear powerful? Why do good people sometimes suffer while evil people prosper? These questions echo through every generation. They appear in moments of personal loss. They surface during times of national crisis. They arise whenever people confront the tension between faith and reality. Habakkuk teaches us that bringing those questions to God is not a sign of weak faith. It is a sign of honest faith. God did not reject the prophet for asking difficult questions. Instead, he invited Habakkuk into a deeper understanding. And that deeper understanding changed everything. The prophet learned that God's justice operates on a timeline larger than human expectations. Empires rise, empires fall, history unfolds. But above it all, God remains sovereign. Habakkuk also discovered that faith is not dependent on circumstances. The fig tree may fail, the harvest may disappear, the economy may collapse, yet faith can still stand. Because faith rests not in outcomes, but in God Himself. That truth has sustained believers across centuries. It sustained persecuted Christians in the Roman Empire. It strengthened reformers in the Middle Ages. It encouraged missionaries who traveled into unknown lands. And it continues to give courage to people facing uncertainty today. Habakkuk UK single quotes S. Journey reminds us that faith is not a straight line. It often begins with confusion. It moves through questions. It wrestles with difficult truths. But if the conversation with God continues, it can lead to a deeper kind of trust, a trust that does not depend on perfect understanding, trust that endures even when the future feels uncertain. And that is why Habakkuk's story still matters, because every generation eventually faces the same decision the prophet faced. Will we allow unanswered questions to destroy our faith, or will we bring those questions to God and allow Him to transform our perspective? Habakkuk chose the second path. And in doing so, he left behind a message that continues to challenge, comfort, and inspire believers thousands of years later. But there is still one final lesson hidden within his story, a lesson about what it truly means to trust God when life becomes unpredictable. And that lesson begins with a simple but profound realization. Faith is not proven when life is easy. Faith is rarely tested when life is predictable. It is easy to trust God when the harvest is plentiful, when the economy is stable, when prayers seem quickly answered, and when the future appears secure. But real faith is revealed in moments when certainty disappears. That is exactly where Habakkuk found himself. His nation stood on the edge of catastrophe. The Babylonian Empire was rising like a storm on the horizon. Political instability filled the land. Corruption had weakened the moral foundations of Judah. And the prophet knew that painful events were about to unfold. Yet despite all of that, Habakkuk arrived at a place that many people struggle to reach. He chose faith over certainty. At the beginning of the story, the prophet wanted answers. He wanted God to explain why injustice seemed to flourish. He wanted clarity about why violence continued unchecked. And when God responded, the explanation only created more questions. How could a holy God use a brutal empire to judge his own people? Why would the wicked appear to triumph, even temporarily? Habakkuk wrestled with these tensions honestly. He did not pretend they didn't exist, but through the conversation with God, something changed. The prophet realized that faith does not require complete understanding. It requires trust in the character of God. That realization transformed the entire direction of his journey. Instead of demanding certainty, Habakkuk embraced trust. Instead of insisting on immediate justice, he accepted God's timing. Instead of measuring God's goodness by present circumstances, he remembered God's faithfulness throughout history. And that shift allowed him to make one of the most powerful declarations of faith ever recorded. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk 3:18. The word yet carries enormous weight. It means Habakkuk had considered the worst possibilities. The fig tree might not blossom. The vineyards might produce no grapes. The olive harvest might fail. The fields might yield no food. The flocks might disappear. The cattle stalls might stand empty. Every visible system of security could collapse. Yet his faith would remain, because Habakkuk's joy was no longer rooted in circumstances. It was rooted in God. That is the central message of the entire book. Faith is not sustained by favorable outcomes. Faith is sustained by the unchanging character of God. And when people understand that truth, they gain a kind of spiritual stability that circumstances cannot easily shake. Habakkuk expresses that stability with another powerful image. The Lord God is my strength. Habakkuk 3:19. Strength, in this context, does not mean the absence of weakness. It means the presence of divine support. Habakkuk knew he could not control the coming events. He could not stop the rise of Babylon. He could not prevent the hardships that would follow, but he could trust the God who ruled over those events. And that trust produced confidence. He will make my feet like hinds' feet. Habakkuk 3:19. In the ancient world, deer were known for their ability to move across steep mountain terrain. Where other animals might stumble or fall, the deer could run with remarkable balance and agility. Habakkuk uses that image to describe what God does for those who trust him. God does not always remove the mountains. Sometimes he gives his people the ability to walk safely across them. And he will make me to walk upon mine high places. Habakkuk 3:19. High places often symbolized victory or security. The prophet is declaring that God will lift him above the chaos of circumstances, not necessarily by eliminating difficulty, but by sustaining him through it. And that perspective transforms the entire story of Habakkuk. What began as a complaint becomes a testimony. What began with confusion, ends with confidence. The prophet who dared to question God discovered that God was not offended by honest questions. Instead, those questions became the doorway to deeper faith. That lesson is just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago, because the world still wrestles with the same tensions Habakkuk observed. Violence still exists, corruption still appears in positions of power, justice sometimes seems delayed. And people still ask the same question. Habakkuk asked, God, how long? Habakkuk's story does not eliminate that question, but it reframes it. It reminds us that God's silence does not mean absence. His timing may be different from ours, but His justice is never forgotten. The rise and fall of empires throughout history confirm this truth. Powerful nations have come and gone. Kingdoms that once seemed invincible eventually collapsed, yet the purposes of God continued moving forward. And the promise spoken in Habakkuk still echoes across time. The earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Habakkuk 2:14. That statement points beyond any single empire, beyond Babylon, beyond Judah, beyond the immediate events of Habakkuk's lifetime. It points toward the ultimate future of the world, a future where the knowledge of God's glory fills the earth completely. Habakkuk did not live to see that promise fulfilled, but he trusted it, and that trust changed the way he lived in the present. Because when people believe that God's story is larger than their current circumstances, they gain courage to endure difficult seasons. Habakkuk's journey shows that faith does not mean ignoring reality. It means interpreting reality through the lens of God's sovereignty. The prophet saw injustice, he saw corruption, he saw coming judgment, but he also saw something greater, a God who rules over nations, a God who judges arrogance, a God who remembers mercy even in the midst of wrath. And that vision allowed Habakkuk to stand firm when everything else appeared unstable. His story ends quietly. There is no dramatic victory scene, no sudden reversal of circumstances, just a prophet who learned to trust God deeply. And that quiet ending carries a powerful challenge for every generation, because eventually every believer faces the same choice Habakkuk faced. Will faith depend on having all the answers, or will faith rest in the character of the God who holds the answers? Habakkuk chose the second path. And in doing so, he became something rare, a prophet who dared to question God and discovered that honest questions, when brought to God, can lead to unshakable faith. Habakkuk's story leaves us with a truth that still echoes through every generation. Faith is not the absence of questions, it is the courage to trust God even when the answers are incomplete. The prophet began with confusion, looking at a world filled with injustice and asking God, why? Yet through that honest conversation, he discovered something deeper than explanations. He discovered the unshakable character of God. Empires would rise and fall, nations would shake, harvests might fail, but God would remain sovereign. And that realization led Habakkuk to a declaration that still inspires believers today. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. His story reminds us that true faith does not depend on circumstances, it depends on who God is. If this story challenged or encouraged you, like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful biblical stories, and share it with someone who needs this message today. And before you go, drop a comment below. What part of Habakkuk's story spoke to you the most?